Here we are trying to explore the possible relevance of Habad Hasidic teachings on prayer for the contemporary Hasidic community, starting with Habad Hasidic community and then the Hasidic community in general, the general Jewish society, whether it's a kind of Orthodox society going to synagogue 3 times a day or down to 3 times a year or never, and then for non-Jewish society. So the question of this paper is, to what extent are these teachings? We've just heard this fascinating presentation about the first 2 generations of Habad. Elliot spoke about these profundities last night, general contemplation, detailed contemplation. To what extent has this any real relevance today for society as a whole? Well, just a little bit. Here is the original manuscript of Rabbi Shneur Zalman's Tanya, the few pages which exist, which contains the contemplative system, which I'm going to be speaking about, like a very simple snippet. Here is copies that Hasidim, followers, or maybe not followers, made of the Tanya. 10 of these still exist. 8 are in the Lubavitch Library in New York, 1 is in London, and 1 is said to be in Haifa University Library, although I've never actually tracked that down. So this one is in the London Library. Here's a manuscript of Rabbi Dov Ber, the 2nd generation, his tract on ecstasy. It's a kind of carefully written manuscript. And here is a page from the Hasidic prayer book that he printed. The line in the middle is from the daily prayers. Baruch she'amar v'haya olam. Blessed be he who spoke and the world came into being. And around are Hasidic teachings with the idea that you contemplate those Hasidic teachings in order to instill radiance into the words of the prayer. And now there's a painting that I want to address. Zalman Kleiman painted this picture. There has been a synagogue service in a shul, little synagogue in Crown Heights, the Baumgarten Synagogue. And then most people have gone home, but now there are people who are left behind in the synagogue. They're all male. Okay, so that's a good question. What about the women? Where are they? But here you have people praying in a melodic way. For example, this person, that's a very general kind of spirituality. He's singing, he feels this profound enthusiasm. Here is someone who is doing what would be called the Hidbonenut b'prat, the detailed contemplation, and he could be in a trance-like state that you could speak to him and he would not hear you. He's just in another world. And this one is in a very interesting state. I think of that more like Kotz Hasidism. He hasn't yet got to the beginning of the prayer. He has to work on himself even to begin praying. And it is said that the painter painted a 2nd version of this painting. And the time here is something like 5-1. But he painted a 2nd painting where it's like 3:30. And all of them have gone home, except for this one, who's still walking with his talit on his shoulder, trying to get to the beginning of the prayer. All right, now this is, it's a sort of very profound thing. But is it just for historians? Is it a reality? I was very pleased over this Shabbat, which my wife and I spent in Toronto, and I went to the Habad, the Lubavitch Mesivta. That's like the junior yeshiva, up to like 16 years old. And there was some member of my daughter-in-law's family, and she had wanted, so would to be member, he's the chatan of her sister, and she'd wanted to invite him for the Shabbat meal. So my son goes over to him and said, would you like to eat with us the Shabbat meal? He said, no, because I want to daven. He was sitting with a Maimonides Hasidut, and he expected his davening to take him, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, something like that. So my son said, all right, maybe we'll make a Hitvadut at home at 4 o'clock. Will you come there? He said, yeah, that I'll come. So, and in fact, several of the young, he's older, he's not 16, he's a Khatan, he was just visiting there. But even the younger boys of 16, 15, a number of them were, as we call it, davening. That means they were putting effort into their prayers. So I was pleased to see that. And it certainly fitted into this talk today. So let's just take the basic elements of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman's system. Now, Tanya was originally produced as a manuscript, as I indicated. The system of contemplation in the manuscript is different and simpler than the one which came out in the printed version of Tanya. So I'm going to address the simple original version. The original version is like this. First of all, he explains, he quotes the Baal Shem Tov, but it's the Baal Shem Tov is commenting on a midrash, that when God created the world, this was not a one-off event. It's the initiation of a continuous process, that there is all the time a stream of divine energy flowing into and creating this existence that we're in, creating the universe. And every particle within the universe, it is all being maintained by a stream of divine energy. And so everything, let's say this table, is there because there's a stream of energy making it exist. Rather like some, electromagnetic phenomenon of today that's, 2 laser beams coming and, making a hologram, something like that. And so therefore, everything is really a product of this divine energy, and he has a wonderful way of thinking of the way that the few verses in the beginning of Genesis, which describe creation, that those verses transmute through interchange of letters and gematriot and transposition of letters into the whole vocabulary of the Hebrew language, so that the name of every object in Hebrew is actually its divine life force. In the 16th century in England, there was a belief that if you brought up a child on a desert island, he would grow up speaking Hebrew. So Hebrew is therefore this sort of divine inner nature of existence, and one could illustrate the special nature of Hebrew like chemical language. You see, salt, in English it's salt, French du sel, German Salz, and any other language. But in chemical language, it's NaCl. And that's what it really is. It's sodium chloride, unless it's low sodium, so it's KCl, potassium chloride. But that NaCl really represents what salt is. And in the same way, melach, the Hebrew word for salt, is actually the spiritual energy within the salt, and shulchan is the spiritual energy within the table. So the next stage of this is, since you can perceive, so there you are, you're in the kitchen, a young woman wants to pray, wants to say the Shema, let's say, and so she's going to prepare for prayer. So she looks around her kitchen, the cooker, the fridge. She conceives in her mind's eye the way all of this exists simply because of a stream of divine energy which is flowing into it. And the next step is to question, what is the reality? Is the fridge really there, or is it only God? And she can come to a perspective sitting there in the kitchen or in the beautiful atmosphere over here. We should really have had the minyan outside this morning, but there was a little bit of rain. The followers of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman would sometimes pray in the forest. And when Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, the sixth Rebbe, published his Zichronot, or when his Zichronot were published as a book in the 1950s, I think it was, the cover had a picture of people praying in the wood. So whether it's the fridge and the cooker or the trees, the sense of the immanence of the divine all around, now that sort of toggles with the concept that, you know what? Ein od milvado. There's nothing apart from God. There is only the oneness of God. And that sense of there just being the oneness of God. So with that in inspiration, a person can then say a few words of prayer. I was once told by Rabbi Yankel Gurkov, an old Hasid in London, I was asking people about contemplative prayer. He said, what is prayer? Zogana pur verte mitanemes, to say a few words with truth. So just that, getting those few words with truth, so the whole contemplative process reaches that. Well, so that's, so taking this basic element of Chabad Hasidic contemplation, to what extent is that relevant in the Chabad Hasidic community? I actually believe it's on an upward path. There was a big dip in the 20th century, in the middle, because the tremendous activism of the Seventh Rebbe seemed to knock contemplation out of the way. But at the same time, when one looks at the teachings of the Seventh Rebbe and his letters, we find a lot of advice about contemplative prayer. And in his sort of canonical little book of Hayom Yom, from day to day, where he inserted little paragraphs or sentences from the previous Rebbe, from the sixth Rebbe. One of these teachings is the beginning of the descent, God forbid, is lack of contemplative prayer. The air becomes thickened and everything becomes dry. Even all the ordinary daily mitzvah just become difficult to do. And of course, a person who's in such a state is incapable of having a positive effect on anyone else. So he's covered both boxes. It's not only your own service of the divine which is lacking, but also the hafatzah dimension, the communicating of Judaism, of spirituality to others, is also lacking. And I believe, particularly during the last period of the Rebbe's teachings, with a very strong emphasis on Mashiach, the coming of the Messiah, for many people, there was a new interest in discovering the inner messianic consciousness, which is achieved through contemplative prayer. Because through this profound process of entering into the radiance within existence and the radiance, you see there's a continuum. When you have a prayer book in front of you, which is in Hebrew letters, and you are aware of the Hebrew letters in existence, and in Tanya Shah Yichud, the Gate of Unity, which I've been speaking about, it compares the letters in the mind of the prophet to the letters in existence. So it's all the continuum, everything is one. So that is a state of consciousness similar to consciousness of the time of the Messiah, with the unity of everything that Eliot was talking about being revealed in the details of the world around. So there is, obviously one would need to do some kind of, real study of what people think about. I was very, it was upbeat for me, this Toronto Mesivta, write a little article about the Mesivta in Toronto, their approach to davening, their approach to prayer. That's something special. But I believe that around the world, in Australia, in Melbourne, there's a big synagogue, and the big synagogue has a little adjoining room called a Chabadnitza. It's a room where you just go to pray. and to pray at length and in a deep way or in a melodic way, and so other people don't disturb you and you don't disturb them. And someone told me he was looking to have a little shir, studying something with someone else. They went into this Chabadnitzer, and he was told off, hey, no learning here, you'll disturb the prayer atmosphere. This place is for prayer. You know, that was a few years, not very long ago. So that's in the Chabad community. Now, what about the general Jewish community? Thanks to New Age 3. Yeah, okay. What are you giving me? Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So thanks to a whole lot of different forces which are fascinating, New Age, Kabbalah Center, all kinds of different streams of energy floating through society, the general Jewish world is much more interested in contemplative spirituality than 40, 50 years ago. It's an amazing phenomenon, and just recently I was invited to a very non-Hasidic big English synagogue where we had a little group for 3 sessions studying contemplation in prayer, you know, and they wanted to do that. They're actually recorded and they're on my website, which if you bother to look at the paper, there's a bibliography there showing where to find them. So that's in the Jewish world as a whole, and I believe that could be promoted much more widely, the idea of spiritualizing prayer, and I believe that people want that. Now, what about general society? Now, here we have a very interesting thing. Oh, wait a second. I just want to say another little bit. I happen to have, by divine providence, on this PowerPoint, contemplation was not only for men. In Riga, in 1940, there was a little group called the Achot Hatmimim. One of these girls, you can see her over here, Chaya Sima Mikhailova, she wrote a letter to Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak from Otvotsk in 1939 or 38. That picture was from 1940. But in 1938, she wrote a letter to Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, who was in Otvotsk, asking what to do with the emptiness of action. And he responded with an incredibly profound meditative system. One of my pupils, I also teach in a girls' school as well as university, and one of my Achot Hatmimim pupils drew a diagram of that there's thought, speech, and action, and within the thought there's also thought, speech, and action. So you can get to the thought of the thought, and then you can go higher, the thought of the thought of the thought. And it's a meditative system whereby you go to the very essence of any concept, like in the beginning God created the world, and you get from the radiance to the essence, to the divine, to the infinite, like going up in stages. And he was teaching this system to this little girl, to this young girl. And, I researched her, and she was like a very normal young woman. Unfortunately, they were quite likely all killed in the Holocaust, but Hashem Yidrosh Damam. But then, let's take this a bit further. So I'm going back to my basic theme. How do we take these teachings into general society? Now, in 1965, the Gate of Unity and Faith, which is the part of Tanya which I've been discussing, which gives this contemplative system, was published in English translation, a thin little book published in English. Around 1967, the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, one of my reasons for wanting this book to be published in English is so that non-Jews will be able to read it, and I believe that they will be interested in it. And he says to his Hasidim, you will be surprised how interested they will be. It's a fascinating way of putting it. And then came a number of campaigns very much not understood and not welcomed by the general Jewish community in the United States. The Rebbe was campaigning either for public prayer in schools, in the general public schools, or a moment of silence. And he strongly campaigned for a moment of silence with the idea that that would be a moment of reflection and meditation for a child, and saying, as he said on Yud Shvat, now the 10th of Shvat is the anniversary of Rabbi Menachem Mendel becoming Rebbe. On that day, I'm concluding now, on that day he said, the daily moment of silence, the argument was, is it in the spirit of the Constitution, division of church and state? He said, yes, it is. He quoted the founding fathers. They were running away from religious persecution. They wanted to have religion. They weren't denying religion. They just didn't want to be controlled by the government, as they were in England, persecuted. So therefore, he put his money on the idea of a moment of silence. And although there were several court cases in those years of the 1980s where they were forbidden, schools were forbidden to have a moment of silence, now, the last count being that I know of, in 2014, 34 states in the USA permit moment of silence or time of prayer in the public schools. And I believe that these teachings from the Gate of Unity and Faith, in the simple sense in which I've described it, actually, which is according to the manuscript version, there's a more profound level which you can read about in the article, but I do believe that's something which has currency today. Thank you.